AI is only going to continue to get more advanced and more smart, and we'll never obviously hopefully have the creativity or the passion that people do, and it's going to be kind of a scary thing for working in journalism to be able to decipher what's real and what's fake.
But correspondents and reporters are still important, and I hope that enough young people get inspired by it and can figure out how to deal with the chat GPT and AI, because it's ripping off a lot of things.
Hi, my name's Owen Samos, and welcome to Youth in the Booth. Today, my guest is Joe McQuaid. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Owen. Thank you very much.
It's great to have you on. So, the people at home who don't know, Joe McQuaid is the former publisher of the Union Leader, the only statewide paper here in New Hampshire. You are a longtime New Hampshire journalist, covering stories since high school. Your voice and views have been crucial to deciding the outcomes of the New Hampshire primary and politics as a whole in our country. You are the president and a founder of the Nackey Loeb School of Communications, which teaches about the First Amendment, journalism, and communications. You've written 4 books, including your brand new book about your parents' work during World War II. Welcome to Youth in the Booth, Joe.
Thank you very much, Owen. The only thing that I would tweak is when you said that my voice and views were crucial to some sort of presidential or other politics. I think that is way overdrawn.
I don't know.
No.
I've heard some stories about what you've done for New Hampshire politics.
I'd like to hear them. Well, New Hampshire politics as opposed to national politics was certainly not crucial there.
New Hampshire primary can help decide, who becomes the president of the United States. So I think about it more like that.
Paper's usually on the losing side of that, but that's okay.
So I was going to ask a question actually related to that. What is your experience being the person everyone who is running for president wants to have an endorsement from, specifically the paper itself, but from you?
Well, not everyone has ever wanted the endorsement of the paper. No, truly, a lot of candidates, mostly on the Democratic side, would run screaming, hair on fire from the room, please do not endorse me. We're a conservative newspaper with conservative views, and therefore only sought out by the more conservative candidates. Even some Republicans haven't always wanted to get the endorsement of the paper. The good experience, though, is that almost all of major candidates have wanted to be interviewed by the newspaper because it's free publicity, which is tough to come about these days. So we've been able to meet a lot of people who were in presidential races.
Right. But yeah, so the Union Leader is the only statewide newspaper we have here, in New Hampshire. So it usually is, pretty important for a candidate to get, at least some type of thing run in the paper. So it's because most people in the state are probably going to read it.
Well, newspapers do not have the reach that they used to have. Now, I think you're an exception. You may read newspapers, the Union Leader and probably the Concord Monitor, because you have them in your home. But a lot of people, especially people your age and a bit older, no longer read newspapers or care much for the news. So I think things have changed in that regard. For people who do read, it's a good source of information, the Union Leader, not so much because it's statewide so that people all over can read the paper, but so that we can report on the news from Concord, the state capital, as well as major cities and hamlets. I was once struck, I've probably been struck several times, but I was struck in bringing Mrs. Loeb, who owned the paper for a long time, up to Dixville Notch when the hotel up there was still going strong. And it was a legislative gathering, New Hampshire legislatures. And as you probably know, there are 424 of that species.
Quite a lot.
And one of them took me aside and said how important it was, especially for the North Country people, that there was the newspaper, because otherwise there were not a lot of sources of information about what was going on down below the notches. And this was in the day when the MUR-TV didn't have much to offer at all. So it's, I guess it's a responsibility that the paper has always fondly had.
Right, exactly. And this is kind of going into something else I was going to ask about, what do you find so important about journalism and the First Amendment as a whole?
Well, without the First Amendment, journalism wouldn't have a leg to stand on in the United States of America. And a lot of politicians would like that to be the case today, where news media were not allowed to say anything they wanted to within the reasons of slander and libel, but also wouldn't want them to report on a lot of stuff. There's a bill which coincidentally comes up this month in Concord relative to the right to know law, and this bill would tweak it so that if you make a request and the town or city or government official estimates that the request is going to take more than 10 hours of his or her or the unit's time, then they can charge you for it.
Oh.
And while it may seem harmless at first, my request isn't going to take 10 hours. It's an open invitation for all those city and town officials to say, yeah, it is going to take more than 10 hours, and hope that discourages the requester enough so they don't fulfill it. And that's not good for the body politic to not be able to get information which is the public's information. New Hampshire has a very strong constitution relative to that, and the right to know law is founded on one of the articles from the Constitution, which I'm paraphrasing, but it says openness in public affairs being very important. The public shall not be denied the right to the public's information. That's how newspapers and other news media operate, is they don't just sit around and say, woe is me. They go out and see what is happening in their communities.
Right, and obviously with modern times, kind of where people get their news is changing significantly.
If they're getting it
If
at all.
Getting it at all, if they're getting correct information, because I see a lot of stuff on social media that I don't know if it's actually trustworthy what I'm reading.
Well, if it's from Trump, it is, and that goes without saying. Just kidding.
We could get on that topic a little bit later. When I was going to ask you about your experiences with having to deal with different presidents. You've met quite a lot, if I'm correct.
I've met maybe 3 or 4.
3 or 4, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
That's,
Well, I guess it's quite a lot. But
that is quite a lot.
Your standard, but yeah, it's been interesting.
Do you enjoy having the privilege to interview and meet with and the favors of presidents?
Well, the only president that I met with and interviewed in the White House was Ronald Reagan, and meeting with any president in the White House is a high privilege. The others I think I've talked on the phone. I've talked on the phone, interviewed George Herbert Walker Bush. I met Bill Clinton before he was president. Another one, I'm not sure that there is another one. But Reagan's my favorite anyway.
Like your favorite?
Yeah.
I was going to ask, do you have any good stories about...
How much time do you have?
Oh, we have plenty of time, and it's only 8 minutes in so far. So if you got an interesting story about some presidents or just in general...
Before Reagan was president, he was involved in a famous debate in Nashua, New Hampshire. They call them debates. They're not debates. There haven't been good debates since Lincoln versus Douglas. Instead, TV personalities or news people ask questions of one candidate or another. The candidates don't really have a debate interchange. But this particular set 2 was in Nashua at the Nashua High School. There was only one high school then. And I was one of 3 reporters asked to question Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, 2 of the candidates in the 1980 presidential primary. And we get down to the Nashua High School auditorium, which is jam-packed, and nobody knows what is going to happen because the rules have changed. The Nashua Telegraph was supposedly sponsoring this debate between Bush and Reagan. But the Federal Election Commission said the National Telegraph couldn't sponsor this debate between just 2 of the candidates because that would be a political contribution. And it went back and forth. And Reagan got the bright idea to invite the other prominent candidates into the hall, which he did. So all these guys show up, Bob Dole, John Connolly, a lot of big names. And he wants to explain the situation to the audience. And as he attempts to do so, the editor of the National Telegraph says to the sound guy, cut off his microphone. And Reagan you can see him getting visibly irritated. And he shouts to the great glee of the crowd, don't cut off this microphone. I'm paying for this microphone. And the crowd goes wild because the talk at the time from the mainstream press, which is mostly, you may not know this, but they're fairly liberal. And their shtick at the time was, Reagan is too old to be president. You know how old he was at the time?
I don't know. In the 60s?
68.
A little bit younger than the previous two presidents that we've had, yes.
The current, the irony of the current guys running. So he's all fired up. And meanwhile, George Herbert Walker Bush is sitting on his hands in the other chair, not saying anything. So he looks weak. And the stories the next day is Reagan knocked it out of the park. And he cleaned Bush's clock. He won the primary by a great deal. So fast forward to the White House, where I'm about to interview the president, and I'm asking his press secretary if anybody ever asked President Reagan where Reagan got that line about I'm paying for this microphone. Because everybody thought at the time this was just Reagan showing his ire. Well, there was a movie put out in 1948 starring two friends of Ronald Reagan, a guy named Spencer Tracy and a woman named Katharine Hepburn. And the movie was about Tracy being a Republican moderate candidate for the White House, and he's being told what to do by the evil campaign manager and the evil newspaper publisher. And Tracy finally has enough of this. And the denouement, the big scene in the movie, is in his living room. This is 1948, mind you, but they have a TV camera there. And as Spencer Tracy starts to speak from the heart, he sees the evil campaign manager giving the cut sign to the camera. And what do you think Tracy says? He says, don't touch that microphone. I'm paying for that microphone.
That's crazy. Obviously, Reagan worked at the acting scene, if I'm correct, as an actor beforehand, so I know he might have known a lot of people, but that's such an interesting idea that I don't know how he, in the moment, could think of that, perfect line. So
some people will say that, no, he didn't get it from the movie. Some others say it as gospel that he got it from the movie. But I'm still surprised to this day. I did, of all things, a political podcast a few weeks before the New Hampshire presidential primary, and I told that story to the people, and they're from Politico, right? They never heard it.
Really?
Yeah, before. But if you Google it, you'll see a lot of references to it in the movie. Anywho, I'm a coward. I went to the White House. I asked his press secretary, has anybody ever asked him if he got that line from the movie? And the press secretary said, no, and if I were you, I wouldn't ask it either. And I didn't have the courage to ask it. Opportunity lost. That's my most interesting presidential primary story.
Interesting. I was going to say, I don't know. I've never heard that story. I did read part of the Politico interview beforehand.
Podcast, yeah.
A podcast. I was more, I don't know if you're okay with talking about this, I was more interested, change that. I was more glued to the section where you talk about your back and forth with the previous president of the United States. I know you've had a little bit of a...
Donald J. Trump?
Yes, that one. You've had a bit of a history, if I'm correct.
He wasn't president then. He was a guy looking for the union leader's editorial endorsement because he was presumably a conservative candidate. But he ended up calling me every name in the book, a liar and a loser, and the paper was going under. And
a real lowlife with that piece of garbage paper, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. But before that, he was in my office trying to be nice and chum up and get our support. And the story about that interchange with the future president is it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm exhausted by this guy, but I hear a noise at the door, and I know who it is. It's the janitor coming in to clean my office. So I say to the guy at the door, come in, Jorge. And I say to Trump, who has already famously been dissing anybody from South America. Right. And I say, Mr. Trump, this is Jorge. Jorge's from Colombia. I wanted to see the reaction from Trump. And Trump says, "You're from Colombia?" And Jorge says, "Sí." And Trump says, "Do you know so-and-so?" And I'm thinking to myself, what circles does Trump think my janitor runs in that they would know the same people in Colombia? Only Jorge says, "Sí, I know her." Now I'm really flabbergasted. And Trump turns to me and explains, she's the current Miss Universe, which was a pageant that Trump sponsored. And the Miss Universe had been Miss Colombia. So he won that one. I finally get rid of Trump. I'm exhausted. I go around the corner to my son's office, and I want to tell him about the interchange between Trump and Jorge. And my son says, "Yeah, Jorge was just in here. Tell me about it." I said, "Really? What did he say?" He wanted to know, he asked Brendan, "Who's that guy with your father?" Jorge didn't know Trump from a hole in the ground. That's it.
So explain a little bit more about that section there. Was he like interested, or are you saying it in a way that like how Trump was able to connect to people?
No,
or?
I'm saying in a way that Trump didn't, Jorge didn't know Donald J. Trump from a hole in the ground. And I thought that was very amusing. This guy with the big aura.
Oh, okay, I see.
I was
looking. Yeah.
You know, a major
Right.
candidate for president. And Jorge is asking somebody in the bill, "Who's that guy with your father?"
Because Trump was well known at that point, even as before he ran for president.
I used to greet, when candidates came to be interviewed at the Union Leader, presidential candidates, I went out front to greet them. And when I went out front to greet Trump the first time he came, he's looking over my shoulder. And I turn around, and in the lobby of the building is just about every employee in the building. And my son explained it to me later. "Dad, the guy is a TV star.
Right.
He's a known quantity. People want to see him. Not necessarily vote for him, but see him."
Just want to see him.
Yep. So that's my two presidential stories.
The two presidential stories.
Yeah.
I would like to ask a more personal, especially relating just to yourself here. Can you kind of explain the experience of when you first voted and how you felt about doing it?
No, I can't, because I don't remember that far back. And when I first voted, it wasn't age 18. It was age 21. And that would have been in 1970. So there wasn't a presidential election that year. So I'm sure I voted for state offices, but I have no whoopee memory about it. Perhaps it's because I had already been covering political candidates for the newspaper when I was 18 and 19 and 20. So it was just, nobody hit me over the head with a bottle of champagne. I feel cheated.
Do you remember the first president that you voted for? Or a president
no.
who was running for president?
I would have to presume that in 1972, that was tricky. Richard M. Nixon.
Oh, okay. I know him by his formal name. That is not his nickname.
The trickster. And in the presidential primary, no, I probably didn't vote for him. Our newspaper and its publisher at the time, William Loeb, was outraged with Nixon because Nixon had made some sort of rapprochement with Red China. And Loeb was big against Red China. And so Loeb was backing some conservative candidate, John Ashbrook, I think his name was. He was a congressman from Ohio. And I probably voted for him in the primary. But then in the general election, 1972, sort of rock and a hard place for a lot of Republicans. The Democratic candidate in 1972 was George McGovern, who was way to the left on the issue of the Vietnam War. And so was McGovern or Nixon. So the Union Leader's advice to voters was hold your nose and vote for Nixon, which they did.
All right, because he did win, yes.
He did win, but he didn't see out his term because he was.
Is that the tricky part you're talking about?
His
trickster thing was for that,
no,
or for Watergate, or
the media had labeled him tricky long before that, and the Union Leader played a part in Watergate as well.
Oh, do you want to explain a little bit about this? I actually don't know the story behind
Well,
this.
there was a candidate in 1968 against Nixon. His name was Ed Muskie.
Oh, okay, maybe I have heard this story.
He was a U.S. senator from the neighboring state of Maine, and Loeb was out against him. And Loeb, one day, his readers opened up his paper, and there is a front-page editorial by William Loeb that says, "Muskie insults Canado-Americans." A lot of French Canadians in Manchester and the Mills. Turn to the editorial page, and there's a reproduction of a letter to the editor, which Loeb has received from a guy from Deerfield Beach, Florida, in which he says, "Dear Mr. Loeb," spells his name wrong, says it's the Manchester Guardian, not the Union Leader. And it says that this guy named Paul Morrison and his buddy went to see Muskie, who was campaigning in Florida, and they asked Muskie if Muskie had any trouble with black people in Maine. Now, by this time, the story should cause people to question, but Muskie allegedly said, "No, we have trouble with Canucks." Now, the Canucks were already a National Hockey League team at the time, but Canuck was still a slur to some Franco-Americans. And Loeb ran this letter and said Muskie insulted Franco-Americans. Never bothered to ask the Muskie camp before he ran this letter for their reaction or to confirm that Paul Morrison existed or had been to this place in Florida. So it ended up with Muskie pulling up in front of the Union Leader on a snowy Saturday morning, and either he got tears in his eyes or the snow was melting in his eyes, and some of the national media said Muskie had cried about this, and that was the end of Muskie's campaign.
You covered that section, correct, about the what was when he got there, right? You were there.
No, I was already the editor of the Sunday paper.
Oh, okay.
I was a ripe old age of, I think, 23 at the time. And the reporter who covered it, who went out front, I told her to call up Mr. Loeb because Muskie had said that Loeb was a liar and a coward and a scoundrel. And I said, get Mr. Loeb's reaction. She wouldn't do it. She was too scared. So I had to get on the phone and talk to Mr. Loeb, who told me, a guy like that gets upset what a little newspaper publisher says. I wouldn't want him in the White House with his finger on the nuclear button. I didn't know at the time. I later wrote a book on William Loeb. I didn't know at the time that in 1960, another presidential candidate had gotten up with a much bigger crowd in front of the Union Leader building and said, and you won't recognize this at all, but I'll tell you who it is. Maybe you'll guess it from your history. The candidate said, there may be a worse newspaper and a worse publisher in these United States than the Union Leader and William Loeb. But if there are, I can't think of them right now.
Are you referring to John F. Kennedy?
Hey, way to go. Hey, my accent still works. And, of course, the reporters had to ask Loeb what he thought of that. And Loeb said, guy like that gets upset what a little newspaper publisher said. I wouldn't want him in the White House. Apparently it was his shtick. He used it more than once. But I probably voted for Tricky in the 72 general election. The Watergate stuff didn't really start to come out until right after that.
Later, right.
Yeah.
And just to make it clear, the paper published that he, in fact, had snow on his face, correct?
Yeah, the paper really didn't get into the it said he was emotional, but that's all it said. And he was also emotional, allegedly, about another thing that the paper had run, which was not even original with the paper. It was from Newsweek magazine. It was a little item about Muskie's wife being on the campaign bus, kicking her heels back, smoking a cigarette, and talking with the girls. And the editorial in the paper just reran that, but said, is this the behavior of a first lady in the White House? Muskie used that as his other reason for supposed outrage at the paper. Well, he didn't go down in front of the Newsweek building in New York City and rail at the publisher to come out and talk to him for being a coward. I think Muskie did all this because he was losing ground to McGovern, and he needed something. And I wouldn't be surprised if, sort of like Reagan with the microphone, Muskie may well have known about the Jack Kennedy thing against Loeb in 1960 and thought he could accomplish the same thing, rally up his base. But unfortunately, he choked up. AP and UP said he cried. AP did. I don't think UP did. And that was the end of him.
And you were pretty young, at least.
I was young, and I got
young,
to write
yes.
a headline for the front page of my paper the next day that said, Muskie calls Loeb liar. And I still had a job the next day. I was concerned.
Right. And, you had a passion for journalism at a young age, and I wanted to ask the question about how do you see this next generation of people getting into journalism. Are you optimistic about it? How things are going?
I think there are young people who are interested in news media and being a part of it. As a matter of fact, the Nackey Loeb School hosts something called the Brodsky Prize, which is put on by a father and his late son to encourage high school kids to get involved in journalism by putting on this scholarship. Anybody is welcome to apply, loebschool.org. And we get some pretty interesting, innovative, and intelligent samples from the people who are applying for it. So I'm not so discouraged about young people in journalism as I am in not only young people, but a lot of people in general, not concerned or not reading and listening to facts about policies and candidates.
Right. So you're hoping that there's becomes more of a return back to hopefully other sources of information and media pertaining to news in general, but also seems specifically politics.
No, I hope it's all
Everything.
artificial intelligence and that I get to control it. AI, man, that's the future.
It is taking people out of their jobs. It sounds like, if I'm correct, in media in general.
It's doing a lot of things that are very untoward, and that's another reason that I hope people wake up to what's happening.
Right.
Even in the New Hampshire presidential primary, they had a guy who concocted Joe Biden's voice and called people up, robo-dialing, 2 days before the primary, saying one of his catchphrases, and this is Joe Biden, and this isn't malarkey. That's one of Biden's phrases. And don't go vote in this primary because it doesn't mean anything.
I heard about this. It's crazy that and hopefully people didn't believe it, because I know not that much longer later people they published stories about it being fake and not being real. But you just have to imagine the amount of people that got this call and might have believed it.
Some might, and it sounded quite convincing that it was Biden's voice. But it couldn't have been Biden because it was late in the afternoon. That's usually when he has his nap.
Sorry. But yeah, I mean, AI is only going to continue to get more advanced and more smart, and will never, obviously, hopefully have the creativity or the passion that people do, but can replicate people pretty well, and especially, obviously, like voices and eventually pictures, images, and it's going to be kind of a scary thing for, working in journalism to be able to decipher what's real and what's fake. It's
going to be tough on teachers trying to figure out whether the young people are doing their own essays or whether it's Chat GPT. And in a great irony, the New York Times is suing an AI company, maybe Microsoft Chat GPT, because that entity apparently scraped the New York Times for all its facts and figures in order to populate its Chat GPT.
Right, because it needs to take information made by people and create its own version of it. Right?
And they took a newspaper. Can you imagine that? How are you going to believe a newspaper?
Yeah, that is, and without their consent or permission or anything.
Correct. And fair use, the head of Microsoft told Lester Holt. You know who Lester Holt is?
No.
See, because you're a young person. You don't know. Do you know who, I don't watch their broadcasts regularly, but Lester Holt happens to be the anchorman of NBC Nightly News. I'm blanking on the two others. David from ABC.
I'm sure I've seen them before. I just don't know their names.
When I was a kid, I knew these guys. As a matter of fact, at that infamous debate in Nashua, Walter Cronkite, you know that name?
I'm not good with names. I'm good with faces, though.
Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor, who were at that time the anchormen for NBC News and CBS News, came up to moi and asked me what was going on with this debate. And I'm going, wow. I'm like 22, and these heads of major networks are asking me. They were interested in finding out the information, and they thought they'd ask a local reporter who was sitting there. Unfortunately, I couldn't tell them anything. Cronkite had been a World War II correspondent, I think for Stars and Stripes, before he was with CBS. But correspondents and reporters are still important, and I hope that enough young people get inspired by it and can figure out how to deal with the chat GPT and AI, because it's ripping off a lot of things.
Oh, exactly. And you were just talking about World War II correspondents and journalists. I could
Yeah.
briefly, at the very end here, we do have a little bit more time. So if you'd like to talk a little bit about, you wrote a book, correct?
Yeah. That book is called War Fronts and Home Fires. And a friend of mine runs a restaurant in Manchester, and he looked at the cover and he said, I love home fries. I got to get that. And I don't know whether he was dyslexic or he was just really hungry that particular day. But that book, I want to say, wrote itself. My father and mother actually wrote that book because it's a compilation of his stories from 3 fronts of the war, and his letters to her and her letters to him about what she was doing on the home front. There's a saying that goes way back, keep the home fires burning. I must say I don't even know where it originated. I don't think it was ChatGPT. And my mother, like millions of other American women, had to step up during that time period and become the head of the household, deal with children, deal with taxes, deal with rationing of all sorts. You know what rationing is?
Yes, yeah.
And deal with the loneliness that comes from having your husband or your sweetheart or your father or a cousin thousands of miles away reporting or fighting in a war.
Exactly.
And I thought I knew about my father in that war, but until I researched it and read a lot of his stories, I didn't know the half of it. So it was very good.
Yeah, and obviously his work was extremely important to be able to get information out and
It was
during
important.
the war.
It was important to families more than anything. He didn't often cover the big picture of the war. There were about 1,600 correspondents in World War II, although only a fraction of those were combat correspondents like he was, he was at the front line. But he worked for the Chicago Daily News Syndicate, which was used by more than 80 newspapers, and they and their readers were hungry for the news of the guys, not the generals, what Eisenhower was doing, or Churchill and Montgomery and all those people. They wanted to know about their cousin, Joe Schmo. Even my mother sometimes had no idea where my father was until she picked up the newspaper and read his bylined article on it. So it was definitely important work. And as a matter of fact, my father, years after the war, would still get letters from GIs and Navy guys whose parents had clipped out his stories years before, because they were thrilled to find out that their kid was still living.
Exactly. And I think to end it on this, that didn't matter when, since our country's inception, the First Amendment and, journalism is a vital part, of our nation and the importance of getting information out.
It is indeed, but you may be interested in part of that book, which deals with censorship. No story that my father or any other reporter wrote during that war got passed back to their newspaper or radio station without a government censor reading it first and blacking out, or in cases, some of the samples I have, with a razor blade, cutting out whole chunks of it. And they not only censored his reporting, they censored his letters back to my mother.
Wow.
Which really frosted her. The First Amendment was going, and the guy that was the Secretary of the Navy also happened to own the Union Leader in my dad's paper in Chicago. His name was Frank Knox, and he sort of fought for the newspaper people to get as much information as possible.
Exactly. And that's a fight that we're still fighting today.
Yep. Keep it up. Keep it up, youth in the booth.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.
Youth in the Booth is recorded here at Concord Community Television Studios at Concord High School. If you're interested in seeing more from my podcast, you can check out my Instagram at Youth in the Booth Podcast, or check out the website www.youthinthebooth.com.